It has been quite a while since the launch of KT24. There have been tournaments that have come and gone, a lot of complaints from the outside, of course, in the realms of Reddit and all of that. But most of us were sitting here, waiting, just sure that a Dataslate was going to drop soon. We believed at the beginning of January, definitely before LVO. There's no way they could have let a tournament go off with how crazy imbalanced some of the teams in this entire format feel when you fight against them. But there was radio silence, and LVO has come and gone, and of course, with small pieces of controversy that may or may not honestly matter. It probably doesn't. But now, January 29th, finally, the Dataslate dropped. Sort of. It's not like the Dataslates of old, where they collected everything into a single PDF format and allowed us to browse and see how all of our foes got enhanced while we sat there waiting for even slight morsels of updates to our own team. But this time around, we have some changes to universal equipment. The core rules got a slight update, mostly with terrain. The Scout Squad, Gellerpox, Inquisitorial Agents, Novitiates, Imperial Navy Breachers, Void Dancers, Kasrkin, Hand of the Archon, Fellgor Ravagers, Nemesis Claw, Warpcoven, Blades of Khaine, Death Corps, Brood Brothers, Farstalker Kinband, Hunter Clade, Legionary, the Chaos Cults, Plague Marines, the Hierotek, the Tempestus Aquilons, and Vespid Stingwings all got some fairly sizable or minor shifts depending on the team. I have quickly browsed over the surface of this, and I have to say there are some wild changes to teams that I didn't even expect to see any kind of buffs or nerfs, but such is the way as these seasons progress. You're not too sure who's going to end up being a winner or loser in this journey towards the impossible balance. Before we get into it real quick, this is YouTube, so if you enjoy tabletop gaming, are a huge fan of Kill Team and potentially other systems, don't forget to hit that subscribe, maybe a form of thumb if you're interested. And with all that said, let's dive into the nuance of the rules shifts in January 2025. A quick criticism of how they've released this. I did prefer the single page to see all updates. It's a little awkward having to click around to multiple places, but it might just take a little bit of getting used to. And in this instance, I would like to start with the core book update. As you can see here, we are mostly looking at changes to terrain functions. Beyond the terrain though, we have the key principle change on data cards with operative stats, just being a quick little reminder that if your stat changes during an action, the actual stat for the rule won't change truly until after the action has been completed. This is of course important, as you can technically dip within an injured state during a fight action, but you won't really take that damage or the change to your overarching stats until it's all complete. No hitting on 3s until they finally take you below half, and then you're just hitting on 4s for some reason and you lose a bunch of dice. Nothing that serious. The firefight phase counteract ploy did have a little bit of a shift. I know this action is a little sore for some people, as the Astartes can really take advantage of it. And the shifts this time around are in limiting that potential, specifically in removing the ability for opponents to utilize guard with counteract, which was one of the major negative issues with the Astartes rule, specifically in Gallowdark and with some unique units. The operative that uses counteract can also not finagle their way around that 2-inch movement limit using things like teleport and the like. Absolutely a good way to rein in this action. To further push this, the guard action will go away if it performs a move or is set up as well, slightly pushing the limits even further. Beyond that, we lean into Vulcus Stronghold adjustments, changing general objects on the actual parts of terrain to be heavy and blocking when maybe people didn't think they were, insignificant and exposed on a small piece of rubble on the side of a second floor building, allowing you to of course jump over it without costing any movement, ensuring that the door on one of the strongholds on the second floor is considered accessible so that units with small bases don't just have the advantage of going through it. Everyone will have to pay an inch. And an attempt at limiting the 3rd story in Stronghold, only allowing you to have 1 friendly operative on the highest level, and that you cannot place that operative in the center. You must allow for your opponent to potentially send a unit up there to attack your operative. I don't imagine that this clears up a lot of the issues people have on Vulcus and other Vantage style maps, with snipers in high positions being near impossible to bring down. Some of the layouts would even prevent you from getting into a position worthy of attacking your foe until maybe turn 3 or 4. And if you've already gone that far across the map, you're most likely winning without the need to defeat that sniper. Moving on to the universal equipment. We already had the big shift, changing a lot of items to need to be set up away from access points and accessible terrain. That was all fine. Here, we only get a slight buff for the heavy barricade, which originally was only allowed to be set up wholly within 3 inches of your drop zone. Now they've added an extra inch, making it 4, which is a little bit more tactical and just helpful with a lot of teams who need that mid area of heavy terrain to allow them to move up larger than normal operatives. I'm looking at you, Gellerpox. A mild shift to the core rules and the core equipment of the current edition of Kill Team. All very useful and all, of course, tied into prior updates. But I know what you're here for. Let's get into the teams. We'll start with the Aquilons, a quick little shift. They had a minor update prior just to change some function and wording. This time around, their strategic ploy Drop and Secure got a little bit of an update, clarifying that it persists until the ready step of the next turning point. This is helpful when it comes to controlling objectives, just allowing these guard to dig in a little harder. The second change is in the firefight ploys with Hot Drop, and I admit I haven't really looked too hard into the Aquilons yet, so I am going to make a slight assumption here. This did change it so that both when a Tempestus Aquilon drops using their team ability or drops off of a vantage of at least 2 inches or higher than the kill zone floor, they would be allowed to reroll an attack against an enemy within a certain range of themselves. The vantage point function is what they added, which allows this team to utilize this ploy beyond turning point 2, as that is when the actual deep strike function tends to end. Still though, this ploy is very limited in that it will only occur if deep striking occurs or if the map has vantage. No real benefit in the Gallo Dark, sadly. Next up, the Blades of Khaine with a Dire Avenger shift. Simply put, the defense tactics rule has gained the balanced function for that free reroll we all like without having to spend a command point on it. Simple and clean for a team that made it so far in LVO. Maybe Games Workshop is happy with how they feel. The Imperial Navy Breachers also got an update. Don't get too excited. They're not exactly coming around in terms of the balance, I feel. Their Brace for Counteract ploy gained the benefit of not only affecting operatives that haven't performed charge, fallback, or reposition, but also any operative that is considered within your territory or your half of the kill zone. So there's a little bit more damage mitigation for the units that you use and maneuver on your own side. This, of course, allowing damage of 3 or more to be reduced by 1. That 3 is also a slight shift, which might be a little helpful. I can't exactly remember what the limit was before, but 3 tends to be the normal level for most feel no pain functions. And then the Sergeant at Arms operative got a slight upgrade with its Command Breach ability, or at least a slight shift. It allows for the attack order or defense order strategic ploy to be used for free, helping out a little with the command point necessities of this team. And then when the Sergeant at Arms activates, there are some adjustments it can make to the actual token placed on the field. It can either be removed and placed again, allowing for it to have benefits in a different area that might be a little more beneficial at the time, or to change what type of token it is in that moment. It's an either or situation, movement or shifting. You don't get to have it all. The Brood Brothers got a rules commentary update, which should be taken into account with more than just this team, depending on how interactions occur. As we just went over with the core update, stats that might be shifted due to injury or something else during an action aren't considered to have been changed for that action until it ends. And in this instance, if the Brew Brother performs an action that happens to get it killed, but is currently utilizing its Cult Devotion strategic ploy, which does happen within that action, the hit rate will not be worsened, but only if the unit was not injured at the start of the action. That is a key distinction. Being injured and then dying, you would still have any of the negative effects. Again, keep this in mind, as this could actually make its way over to other teams as a standard. On to the Chaos Cults, the Ramp Magic the Gathering deck of Kill Team. They actually got buffed here, which is not common with what occurred in the last iteration of Kill Team. The faction rule mutation changed so that during the course of the turning point, there is no longer a maximum ability of 1 to change from Mutant to Torment. You can now change 2, depending on how many mutants you still have at the end of turning point 1. This could be wildly powerful and make for a much more horrifying turn 2, as 2 of these torments come ripping across the field, not just with their enhanced potential, but also with the shift to the strategic ploy Fervent Onslaught, which will allow mutants and torments to accrue accurate 2 instead of accurate 1, greatly improving the damage potential of this already horrifying rushdown horde team. I've always wanted to break my cults out. I might actually take a look at them again soon. The Farstalker Kinband, another squad I was a little interested in, but never really had the time to take a crack at. Their strategic ploy Cutthroats now claims that you add 1 to the attack stat of friendly Farstalker Kinband operatives' melee weapons, of course to the maximum of 5 that already existed. I'm not too sure what shifted there, but as this is amended text, maybe you could remind me in the comments, was it a restriction on who could use it versus now the whole team being able to use it? Either way, hopefully a bonus. As well, the strategic ploy Prey got a little change. In particular, it normally allows a ranged weapon to gain balanced and severe, but if balanced already exists, it now has ceaseless and severe, which commonly across other teams is what occurs in that situation, so this is more of a bringing up to power change. The Kill Broker operative had an adjustment made to its Call the Kill rule, gaining the balanced term as what the friendly operative's weapon will get at that moment. So in this situation, maybe here is where the blend of balanced being upgraded to ceaseless through the strategic ploy might be a key focus. The Kill Broker also gained a shift to its Victory Shriek, with the balanced rule being applied as well. From the equipment, the Piercing Shot and Toxin Shot got a little bit of a clarification, ensuring that you cannot use both the Piercing Shot and the Toxin Shot during the same action. Maybe it was a little too strong and finagly with the wording. The faction equipment trophy also got a bit of a shift, specifically clarifying when the trophy can be used. It has to be during a friendly Farstalker's activation, and it can only occur before or after it performs an action. I imagine some rules wording lawyers were finding some fun things to do with this. The Fellgor Ravagers gained a sort of nerf to their shaman. I say nerf, but it's more of a falling in line rules change. In particular, the Shaman's Mantle of Darkness ability will no longer work on allied Fellgor that are only within 3 inches of it. That Fellgor will now also need to be visible too. So no hiding behind a wall and providing super conceal to a bunch of Fellgor around it. The Gellerpox gained, what are my notes? Buffs? What? In all my years, I never expected to say that. Those words don't exist in that order. I've recently played with this team. I thought they were a little underpowered, but manageable into some opponents. But with what I'm seeing here, they might see more use until they are removed from, of course, the classified segment of Kill Team, although I don't really see myself in too many tournaments anytime soon, so casual play with them going forward might be more of a thing for me. In particular, a lot of these shifts come with their faction rule, which felt a little gimped at times due to the very limited range a lot of it had. It now states that the range of the ability is tied in with which version of the curse you will take. Barrel Warp, the effect that does reduce the attack stat of ranged weapons, will now be 2 inches from any standard Gellerpox infected, outside of course, the little bugs, and it will occur within 3 inches of the glitchlings. Still a bit short distance for this ranged attack detriment, which can be super useful against close range teams, or even if you play very cagey demanding those units to come all the way forward to have to fire upon you. Screaming Rust Spikes only triggers when an enemy is within the actual control range of a Gellerpox infected, which of course is the standard, as this does damage to that opponent if they fail an attack in melee. Basic. But Viral Vox Static actually makes its debut, in my opinion, as probably the more prominent choice when it comes to wanting to play a team and holding objectives, as that range is now 3 inches for all Gellerpox, minus bugs, and 4 for the Glitchlings. Still a bit rare, as it will require your opponent to be a kind of team that likes increasing APL in some way, shape, or form, usually the double APL increase of Commandos, or even potentially the Kasrkin. Still though, I'd lean a little more into those Screaming Rust Spikes, it's just too good. Honestly though, the standout here for me is sort of a olive branch from Games Workshop to teams like this that relied so heavily on its Feel No Pain before and is now faced with the new era of Feel No Pain that has very low potential at drastically reducing the damage anything on the team receives. Limiting that damage reduction only to 1 shaved off the total doesn't really stand against things like Melt-A-Guns. So as a peace offering, the Gellerpox are one of the few, if not only, teams that gets to shave that single damage for a 4+ instead of a 5. A 50-50 chance at being a little bit more tanky than they normally would be. Not bad. The faction equipment Mutated Symptoms also got a little bit of a clarification, ensuring that Volgar Thrice Cursed has a little bit more interaction with the Techno Curse rules, especially when it comes to multiple interactions. And then the faction equipment Plague Bellows got a pretty hefty shift. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but this originally increased the distance of the actual Techno Curse for specifically the Hulks, I believed. At least that's what I remember reading. Now it simply applies to your Hulks the ability to declare a single roll of 3+ on a defensive dice as a normal success instead of discarding it, kind of giving it a one-off 3+ save, so long as the opponent attacking it from ranged is firing upon it outside of 6 inches. The Gellerpox have issues with equipment, because normally you do want to take a doubled up amount of bugs, and depending on your map, you may need to take a heavy barricade just so you can hide some of your larger models. But with this shift to Plague Bellows and the shift to Revoltingly Resilient, we are hopefully looking at a bit more of a sturdy defense into most enemy types. A little more survivability on those massive, ridiculous monstrosities. The Hand of the Archon got a slight rules, I guess, clarification here, specifically that the Cunning rule will not take effect if the strategic gambit being used comes from a mission pack. In concept, when you are playing approved ops, you actually use a strategic gambit to choose your primary op, which made it a little weird for this team to always be able to take advantage. Also, you'll notice that this change claims it is update 1.0. It's a little confusing, but as far as I can tell, 1.0 is simply for the team and not so much the actual release of the rules shift. So as the Hand of the Archon didn't really have a change prior, this would be considered its 1.0? I'm not too sure. The Hierotek had quite a big shift for this new update as well. The faction rule Reanimation Protocol gained a little bit of a nerf though. Its second bullet point does state that it has 1 wound remaining when it stands up. This is different from the D3+1 it would get prior, now limiting the potential revival health of a unit down from 8 to about 5, as they will still get the living metal heal after all of this. The Magnify rule got a little bit of clarification, ensuring that the operative being used as the sort of shooting puppet is where the determination of cover and obscuring comes from. I believe the original thought was that the cover and obscuring rules came from the actual cryptic, which would normally mean the operative would be an obscure at all times against these shots, but since it's now the puppeted unit, it possibly opens up some fun avenues for preventing all of that. The Chronomancer's counter-temporal nanomine, always a point of contention, had its total range reduced from 6 down to 4 for the reduction in enemy movement stat debuff. This of course will make it a little bit harder to use. The Psychomancer's Nightmare Shroud also got a massive debuff, reducing reducing its range from 8 to 4 and kind of limiting the critical retention reduction. Originally, this prevented dice from being rolled or upgraded to crits. This simply allows criticals of 6 to continue to be rolled as such, providing whatever benefits would be gained, but it does prevent lethal, rending, and severe from being a thing. I really thought this was the Psychomancer's time, however, this will turn that around, as this benefit almost feels pointless from within 4-inch range. There will of course be some benefit into teams that have a lot of melee, lethal, rending, and severe. The Technomancer Operative's Repair even got a reduction from 3d3 to 2d3 lost wounds as a heal, and the faction equipment Tesla Weave is now once per turning point when an enemy operative ends its charge within range of a Hierotek Circle operative. You can inflict the damage, as opposed to what it was prior, anytime it would occur, and with as many Hierotek Circle operatives that were within range of the target. I feel like there was a lot of talk about the Hierotek Circle actually being quite powerful, but this overarching debuff situation we have here, honestly, the only real enhancement comes in the form of clarifying the Magnify rule. It just feels like their wings are getting clipped too soon. The Hunter Clade also got a bit of a shift with its faction rules. This is yet another team I haven't seen a lot of interaction with since the revamp of Kill Team, but they seem to be trying to hone in exactly how the faction rule works, and even a ploy we'll go over in a second. In particular, the faction rule seems to be getting a little clarification involving when you pick it, as well as when the actual effects of the imperative are chosen, explicitly that it is still a strategic gambit when you select it. So even though the Doctrina is overall selected, the true benefit will still have to be chosen in a strategic phase. As well, there is a tag being added to the strategic gambit, allowing you to select only the positive and not the negative once per battle. And when going with Bulwark, the effect has been changed when going with the optimization that normal damage of 3 or more inflicts 1 less damage on friendly operatives. Personally, I'm not too sure, but Bulwark most likely has been buffed depending on whether or not that damage originally was 4, which might have been the case. So adjustments and clarifying points there. Over in the firefight ploys, Omnissiah's imperative got a little bit of a change, maybe an enhancement. This is a ploy that can normally be used when a friendly operative is activated, but it has also been adjusted to be triggerable when a friendly operative is being shot at by an enemy. Either way, in both instances, D3+1 damage is inflicted upon the targeted friendly unit for this ploy, which triggers until the next ready step for your army, an additional rule determined by the Doctrina imperative. It is also clarified that when using this ploy while being shot at by an enemy operative, if the save stat is changed for your operative, like with the Bulwark enhancement, that change occurs immediately. And this is a shift that overrides the core rules, which usually says that stat changes cannot occur in most ways during the overall action. Some general adjustments here, and I am hoping a little bit to see some Hunter Clade gameplay. For the competitive scene, they are only going to be around for most likely a half a year, just like my Gellerpox. And just the memories of this team causing so many problems for so many people who just didn't understand their depth. That's something I truly miss right now. The Inquisitorial Agents got a nerf that I think most of us were expecting, and they even got a nerf somewhere else we'll be going over once we get to that team. In particular, an old nerf makes its return. When selecting the units for your team in total, including any requisition units, you cannot have more than 1 weapon with piercing 2 as its rule on that roster, and you cannot include more than 3 weapons with any form of piercing on it. This excludes piercing crits X's. It's a little bit different. This was a nerf they got hit with in the last stage. When it was removed, I was genuinely surprised, so to see it return, yes, fully understandable. The Tome Skull also received a bit of a nerf with its consecrated tome rule, normally allowing it to get back up after the first time it's incapacitated. That is now just gone. It is dead, and that is final, it seems. The Mystic Operative is also now only able to perform a single version of its scry action during its activation. No doubling up for true benefits. The Questkeeper Operative had its Eviscerator weapons hit stat changed to 4, yet another nerf. Mildly reasonable though for this unit with its 5/6 damage line and brutal rule. The Faction Equipment Servo Skull had its once per turn changed to once per battle. This is a shift I'm starting to see within equipment that can occur multiple times, or even over the course of an entire battle for free without any restrictions. I assumed there would be some adaptation to equipment to try to rein in some of these effects that were excessively strong for certain teams. And even the armored bodysuits equipment had to be clarified a little bit that the Tome Skull does not receive this benefit. So a massive damage downgrade for this team, and their normal selection of Kasrkin as allies was also hit, which, rolling over to the Kasrkin, reveals that the Recon Trooper no longer has access to the Kasrkin dash ploy when this unit is reconnoitered to the Inquisitorial Agents. So further pushing that reduced damage to now also giving it reduced mobility. The Kasrkin are still a solid pick for allies, but maybe there's a little bit more purpose behind the Inquisitorial Agents looking into other teams for their assistance. In contrast to the Inquisitorial Agents, the Death Corps actually received a little bit of a buff. Most of their faction rules, specifically the Guardsman orders, got a decent enhancement, nothing too crazy, just a little bit of an extra flair. Take aim, fixed bayonets, both would provide the balanced rule to the weapons that were chosen. However, now these will be ceaseless as the rule instead, allowing for potentially more rerolls depending on how the resulted dice pan out. And as a slight buff in a similar fashion, Dig In used to allow you a single reroll of a defense dice. Now you can reroll a single result of the defense dice, which is very similar to Ceaseless, just for, trying not to take damage instead. The strategic ploy Siege Warfare, normally just providing Saturate, now also gains the benefit of Accurate 1, further pushing the solid damage output consistency that this team was lacking a little bit. And in Death Atonement, tried to clarify at least that the friendly operative is injured for the duration of that action. No doing something claiming that injury isn't the case because there are no wounds to look at. The Legionary were one of the teams ravaging the tournament scene, and it was absolutely inevitable that they would get hit with the nerf bat. The strategic ploy Implacable no longer reduces the piercing rule down by 1, negating piercing 1 weapons altogether. Instead, it specifically focuses on piercing 1 weapons and adjusts their rule to piercing crit 1s, still allowing the enemy player to possibly achieve such an outcome, so a bit less resistance there. Even the strategic ploy Quicksilver Speed took a little bit of a nerf bat as well. It used to be that a legionary in combat with an enemy, regardless of fighting or retaliating, would only ever suffer the problems of enemy damage at the reduction of the enemy hit stat by 1. Now it is required that that legionary in that turning point performed an action in which it moved to gain this benefit. No charging in a bunch in turn 2 and then turn 3 activating this to ensure that all those units are going to survive a bit more. Also, the benefit the Slaanesh Legionary had of reducing ranged weapon hit stats by 1 now requires that enemy to be more than 6 inches from it. Even the Gods of Tzeentch with their Fickle Fates ploy only really applies Ceaseless to a weapon rule, instead of the more consistent Punishing. You still have to try to roll for those hits. Relentless will still trigger if Ceaseless is already active. Even the Fireflight ploy Mutability and Change clarified that if the targeted operative is a warrior, it can no longer change its keyword for its mark during the rest of the turning point. As both the ploy and the ability would trigger upon activation, you could, as the legionary player, choose to go from Tzeentch with this ploy to then move into maybe Khorne or something else. A little situational finagling. The Chosen takes a little bit of a hit here as well, no longer triggering its Soul Gorge ability based on whether critical damage is achieved. It can only gain this benefit if the enemy operative is incapacitated, and it no longer heals D3 plus 3, instead it will be D3 plus 1, reducing the sustainability of this leader. They also clarified that the anointed operative does not stack its damage reduction, which would arguably reduce normal damage of 4 by 2. Instead, you can only reduce any incoming damage from any source for a total of 1, just a little less tanky. The Balefire Acolyte also received a little bit of a nerf, but also kind of a little rules clarification, ensuring that the Siphon Life weapon rule doesn't really have to be used. There is no requirement of a targeted ally for this ability. But then in a mild nerf function, it also clarifies that you can only use this weapon rule once per turning point. No counteract heal, allowing for double heal in a single turn. The Icon Bearer also had its ability kind of adjusted. It certainly requires it to do a little more than just stand around. It now must go to objectives. And then, if it is on an objective in the ready step of each potential strategy phase, that objective will be triggered as tainted. The tainting of that objective provides the team the extra command point it needs, thus limiting the command point gain from turn 1, at least in most map layouts. And interestingly enough, it also claims that if an enemy team has this same rule, those objectives that are tainted will prevent your allied team from doing so on those objectives. Playing into a Legionary mirror match might force your Icon Bearer to sprint as fast as it can to the center of the field and then return to your home base, at least in order to maximize command point gain and prevent enemies from getting a slight edge. And in a way that at least ties a little bit to the firefight ploy of mutability and change, the Legionary Warrior had its personal ability reduced in quality, originally allowing it to just shift every time it activated to any pantheon it so chooses. Now this ability can only occur once per battle. It might not be that big of a change, as I imagine most times it's going to be about survivability, maybe with the Nurgle Pact, until it comes time to get in and murder things up close, at which point Slaanesh or maybe Khorne. So with all of this, the Legionary took quite a big hit with a little bit of its damage output potential, but mostly with its sustainability, making it a bit easier to bring down for some armies that don't really have access to a ton of damage output. I will say something though from looking at this. You'll notice that the Astartes rule is untouched. Most people tend to complain about the Astartes being a little too strong, allowing units like this, as well as units from the Angels of Death or the Phobos or even the Nemesis Claw, to just do whatever they want in a constant state. The core rules changed a little bit of that in a very positive way. Beyond that, I still feel that the Astartes rule might need to continue forward, as it is very hard to balance these extremely small teams when faced against large-scale hordes. The Novitiates are seeing a slight shift within their strategic ploys, specifically with Defenders of Faith being a little reduced in its quality. Originally, it would trigger if an allied novitiate was near an objective marker or a mission marker, but the mission marker side of this thing has been removed, which doesn't really allow for a lot of TAC ops functions to help anymore. This has happened with this team, and I imagine going forward, they might rethink some other teams that have this benefit as well. It also changes the halving of the damage, originally simply stating to round up, which against 2 damage weapons meant 1 damage, which for a team as squishy as the Novitiates isn't really that hard to look at and go, that's fine. But with attempting to make the sustainability of teams a little less intrusive into games, they ensured that there would be a minimum damage number of 2 on any of this damage that has been halved, and that it will only reduce the damage of a single normal success. Criticals will now penetrate this defense. Also, a little clarification with Blessed Rejuvenation, originally stating that upon spending faith points, the operative that was targeted with them would regain D3 lost wounds. They can now choose to regain D3 lost wounds. This gives the agency to the person piloting the novitiates. Maybe you don't want it to heal. Maybe it's fine where it is for one reason or another. All part of your own strategy. The Plague Marines, despite being a very new team, also saw some shifts. They did get a minor adjustment to their personal Astartes faction rule, clarifying that you cannot select the same psychic ranged weapon more than once, which will hopefully allow you to take multiple swings with a psychic close range weapon. Always good to double swing with a corrupted staff. The Malignant Plaguecaster also had its putrescent vitality reduced in overall quality during a round, normally usable as a heal, and then in a counteract phase, yet another heal, but now it is limited to only once per turning point, not unlike the life siphon of the Legionary caster. The flail action on the fighter got a little clarification, ensuring that the D3 result has to be a 3, not so much the dice needing to be a 3 to trigger the poison effect. And the icon bearer for the Plague Marines now must be within its opponent's territory in order to trigger the ability to cast Contagion for 0 CP. A similar yet different nerf to the Legionary icon bearer as well. Again, minor shifts in sustainability for the team. The Scout Squad, a team that I feel is a little more powerful than some people expect them to be. They had their faction rule adjusted and even got a little benefit to it. They can now choose 6 forward scouting options. I'm not sure on exactly what it used to be, whether it was more or less, but at this point it is 6, which, if that's more, is a little bit beneficial, as they did just gain another forward scouting option. Tactical maneuver. For the cost of 1, they can once per battle in the strategic gambit select 1 friendly operative and increase that operative's stat of APL by 1 until the end of its next activation. This can be very good for this team, especially if it gains initiative, as a lot of their abilities are all about going first and hitting hard. Gaining that extra AP could allow a unit to really just blow up over a single activation. Their faction equipment also seems to have been buffed a little bit, or at least adjusted. The targeting oculars can only occur up to twice per turning point, but it seems to have gained lethal 5 on top of the saturate rule that it will apply. Even though most of the people on this team will either have a bolter or a shotgun of some kind, these 2 benefits are extremely powerful for that damage line into about 70% of all other teams. The Vespid Stingwings, a team that kicked off this whole new season, got a little bit of an adjustment that I think will bring people's attention to them in some positive ways due to these big shifts, specifically with their communion faction rule. No longer will you lose all your unspent communion points between rounds. You shall simply grow them as you continue forward, saving up for a really big round 2 or 3, which when tied with their lethality and mobility could push your team ahead of the enemy in score and kills very quickly, as long as you can be a little patient at the beginning. Also, the communion point information that prevented pickup without the use of them, as well as mission actions, no longer includes Operate Hatch, so in the Gallodark you will only have to contend with the actual mission with these communion points, and of course shooting distant targets. As well, the Oversight drone gained a little bit of an enhancement to the aerial guidance action, not only providing the saturate rule, but also the lethal 5 rule, hopefully pushing the lethality of this team right to where it needs to be to warrant the reduced durability that it just exists with. The Void Dancer troop had its Shadowseer operatives Mirror of the Mind's ability focus mostly on enemy operatives that are both valid targets and now within 8 inches of this operative, making this spell a little less effective. It also firmly defines the Shadowseer as a mid-range operative. Between its Silent Seekernade and now the change to Mirror of Minds, this operative will most likely need to be played in a slightly more aggressive and fast situation. And real quick, before we get into the team I'm sure you're all waiting for, the Nemesis Claw almost completely avoided my attention. Only one change with this team, and it's with a piece of equipment, the Comms Jammer. The range on it has been reduced to 3 inches. I feel going forward, many of the ranges on these types of aura effects are going to be adjusted to possibly bring them down in scale, making most of these characters that utilize them have to play in more aggressive situations, putting themselves in danger. I feel with the nerfs to the Legionary, as well as what we are about to talk about, we might see enough Nemesis Claw play to possibly fill this errata out a little bit more by the next data slate. And last, but in no way least, I know the Legionary got hit with a mild nerf bat. They were a fairly big contender, but to a lot of people, the most egregious team when it comes to balance issues. The team I was actually planning on picking up and simply playing throughout most of this year before I saw how powerful they were and decided to restrict myself by going with the Mandrakes more than anything else, the Warpcoven. I know there's a lot of people out there chomping at the bit to see just how hard they got hit. Let's go through it. First up from the faction rules, the Boons of Tzeentch Astral Bombardment. Now, if you select Firestorm or Mindburn with a Sorcerer of Warpfire, whenever that operative performs the shoot action, you can only select the Seeklight or devastating one weapon rule for that weapon to have until the end of the action. Can no longer have both in this situation. The faction rule as well, Master of the Immaterium, points out that the Sorcerer of Temperion's temporal flux ability will only be affected by the Master of the Immaterium benefit on the first part of the overall ability. This will allow you to target an ally within 9 inches, but that ally cannot move more than 6 inches from the token that is placed to allow it to come back. The strategic ploy Ethereal Warding got a similar hit that the Legionary did, where instead of reducing the piercing rule by 1, which could make piercing 1 weapons piercing 0, it instead only targets piercing 1 weapons and simply changes them to piercing crits 1 instead. So the teams that were annoyed at their lack of damage when playing into these dusty boys should find that bringing down Rubric Marines is a bit easier now. The Firefight ploy Psychic Cabal also got a fairly sizable adjustment, a little bit of a restriction. When the sorcerer chooses an allied sorcerer as its target, whichever weapon it is selecting to take for itself, it cannot pick one that has already been used. As well, the sorcerer that is targeted will no longer have access for the rest of the turning point to that weapon that was taken. So you can no longer double up on extremely powerful damage output abilities. Speaking of damage, the Sorcerer of Destiny had its Doombolt weapons damage stat changed to 4, which is normal, but also 2 for the critical rating. The Sorcerer of Warpfire had Light applied to the Seek ability. It also changed its Alight action to provide Ceaseless to an ally benefiting from this ability. The Sorcerer of Temperion had its Heal reined in, now preventing it from possibly going twice in a single turning point due to counteract or any other means, marked with a maximum of once per turning point. And probably one of the biggest shifts that a lot of people are now super happy with. The Rubric Marine Gunner, Icon Bearer, and Warrior have had their save stats changed to 3+. And the fun doesn't stop there, even though Zangors weren't exactly used heavily by most of the lists I've seen in tournament play. The Herd Banner was still adjusted that its effect only occurs against normal damage of 3 or more, not pretty much everything. And that the Relic Hunter rule can now only occur once per battle. So a little bit of a slap down to the Bird Goat men. Even further reduction to the sustainable defense this team has. The Arcane Robes from the faction equipment will now only occur once per turning point. You can select when to use this rule, it won't just trigger willy-nilly. No reducing a Melta's critical damage to normal, thus doing more damage. But they also struck the last part of the overall statement, so now it is only once per turning point overall. No once per turning point per sorcerer. You will need to be very selective. This equipment is still powerful, so you will still most likely want to take it in a triple sorcerer setup. There's no reason not to. It's just the benefit is reduced a fair bit. Even the Sorcerer's Scroll faction equipment got a little bit of a readjustment as well. Now, the sorcerer using this ability has to select a different Boon of Tzeentch, and no other operative can have that Boon of Tzeentch on the field at that moment. This new boon will persist until the end of the battle. Quite the shift for the Warpcoven. Again, the core Astartes rule still remains intact for this team as well as all the others, but this was kind of expected. The hope here for not just the Warpcoven, but the Legionary, as well as even some of the other teams no one really thinks about, like the Gellerpox, these shifts need to not be big enough that the swings at upcoming tournaments in who's going to take top 3 suddenly become wildly outrageous. The issue with Kill Team is always in whether or not the correction is an overcorrection. There's always been this level of attention to details from Games Workshop to try to not do too much, and sometimes a shift on one team or in a general QA or even a core rule will shift specifically overpowered teams that are on the field within certain paradigms of team makeup. Personally, I feel some of the biggest winners here are the Vespid, the Scouts, the Gellerpox, the Chaos Cults, to a lesser extent the Hunter Clade and the Death Corps. But certainly the big teams we were all expecting the nerf bat to strike down. The Legionary and the Warpcoven have taken quite the beating. I am truly interested to see what the end result is of the next big tournament. But now we turn to all of you. How do you think the results of all of these shifts are going to translate into the kill zone? Is it the time of the Horde? Is it the time of the Weird? With the Inquisitorial Agents and their damage drastically reduced, as well as a lot of the Chaos Astartes having their sustainability reduced, is it enough to pull them close and put them within striking range to make far superior matchups across all the variables of the kill zone? Vulcus, the Gallodark, Beta Decima. Do we think this is enough? And if not, what else do you think needs to be adjusted? And please try to put aside your own lack of experience. Don't forget that just because something feels strong to you because you haven't quite cracked the code yet, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's imbalanced in any massive way, only that it exists as a puzzle just beyond the horizon of your knowledge and understanding. Was there any team that might have been overlooked for a much needed buff as well? I'm interested to see how the Fellgor feel. I know they only really received a nerf here, but looking at the team's rules in general, they feel like something that could be extraordinary when used properly. I think I should try them out at my next game. Either way, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're interested in continuing the conversation, don't forget there is a Discord linked in the description. Join up, we'll be happy to have you. As always, likes for the like god and subscribes for the subscribe throne. I am Kimmerix, and I'll see you in the next one.